1939. The year the world descended into darkness. Nazi Germany had just invaded Poland, and within weeks Europe was engulfed in the flames of World War II. But this war would be different from any that came before. Yes, there would be tanks and planes and ships, but the real battle, the one that would determine the fate of millions, was being fought in a realm invisible to the naked eye, the world of codes and ciphers. And at the center of this invisible war stood an unlikely hero. His name was Alan Matheson Turing. He was 27 years old, a mathematician from Cambridge University, who looked nothing like the warriors and generals commanding armies across Europe. Awkward, eccentric, with a high-pitched voice and a nervous stammer, Turing was the kind of person most people would overlook in a crowd. He had unusual habits that made him seem odd, even by academic standards. He chained his coffee mug to radiators to prevent theft, cycled to work wearing a gas mask during pollen season because of severe allergies, and often showed up to important meetings with wrinkled clothes and an askew tie. But behind those awkward mannerisms was one of the most extraordinary minds of the 20th century. Turing didn't just solve mathematical problems. He thought about the very nature of thought itself, about what it meant to compute, to reason, to think. He had already published groundbreaking theoretical work that would later be recognized as laying the foundation for all modern computers. Though few people knew it yet, this strange, brilliant young man would become the secret weapon that would help win the war, save millions of lives, and change the course of human history. This is his story. A story of genius and tragedy, of triumph and injustice, of a man who cracked the unbreakable code but couldn't escape the prejudices of his own time. At the heart of Nazi Germany's military supremacy was a machine. Not a tank, not a bomber, but something far more insidious. The Enigma machine. This typewriter-sized device looked innocuous enough, but it held the power to make Nazi communications virtually unbreakable. Every day, thousands of encrypted messages flowed through German military channels, coordinating U-boat attacks in the Atlantic, planning army movements across Europe, directing the Luftwaffe's bombing raids over Britain. And the Allies were deaf to it all. The mathematics behind Enigma were staggering. The machine used rotating wheels, or rotors, each containing the complete alphabet wired in a scrambled order. As you typed a letter, electrical current would pass through these rotors, each one scrambling the signal further. But here's what made it seemingly unbreakable. After each letter was typed, the rotors would rotate, changing the entire encryption pattern. The number of possible settings was astronomical, over 150 million combinations. To put that in perspective, if you tried one setting every second, it would take longer than the age of the universe to try them all. The British government knew that breaking Enigma wasn't just important, it was existential. Without the ability to read German communications, Britain was fighting blind. U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be built, threatening to starve Britain into submission. The Royal Air Force needed to know where German bombers were headed. Ground forces needed intelligence on troop movements. Everything depended on breaking that code. And so, in the autumn of 1939, the British government assembled a team of the most brilliant minds they could find. Mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword puzzle experts, anyone who showed exceptional pattern recognition abilities. They were brought to a secret location about 50 miles north of London. Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion that would become the nerve center of Britain's code-breaking efforts. Among those recruited was a 27-year-old mathematician from Cambridge University. His name was Alan Matheson Turing. He was awkward, socially inept, with a high-pitched voice and a nervous stammer. He often showed up to meetings disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, his tie askew. He had unusual habits, chaining his coffee mug to the radiator to prevent theft and cycling to work wearing a gas mask during pollen season because of his severe allergies. His colleagues thought he was odd, even by the eccentric standards of Bletchley Park. But what they didn't fully grasp yet was that this strange, awkward man possessed one of the most powerful minds of the 20th century. Turing didn't just think mathematically, he thought about thinking itself. He had already published groundbreaking work on the nature of computation, essentially laying the theoretical foundation for what would become the modern computer. And now, that extraordinary mind was focused on one problem: breaking Enigma. The challenge Turing faced was monumental. Even if you knew exactly how the Enigma machine worked, which the British did thanks to stolen documents and machines captured from the Germans, you still had to figure out which of those 150 million settings the Germans were using on any given day. And they changed the settings every single day at midnight. Any message you intercepted had to be decoded within 24 hours, or it became useless. Previous attempts to break Enigma had relied on human codebreakers painstakingly trying different combinations, looking for patterns, making educated guesses. It was slow, labor-intensive, and often unsuccessful. Turing realized that humans alone could never work fast enough. What was needed was a machine to fight a machine. He envisioned a device that could automatically test thousands of possible Enigma settings, eliminating impossible combinations through logical deduction until it found the right one. In 1940, Turing and his colleague Gordon Welchman designed and built such a machine. They called it the bomb, named after an earlier Polish code-breaking device. It was an electromechanical monster, about 7 feet tall, weighing over a ton, filled with rotating drums and miles of wire. The bomb didn't try every possible Enigma setting. That would still take forever. Instead, it exploited weaknesses in how the Germans used Enigma. Here's where Turing's genius truly shone. He realized that the Germans, being human, made mistakes. They had protocols, routines, habits. Weather reports, for instance, always followed the same format. Military communications often used predictable phrases. Turing called these cribs, predictable pieces of plaintext that likely appeared in the encrypted message. If you had a crib, you could use it as a starting point. The bomb would take that crib and systematically test which Enigma settings could have produced the encrypted text. Through a process of logical elimination, it would narrow down millions of possibilities to just a handful that needed human verification. The first bomb bay became operational in March 1940, but it wasn't immediately successful. The machine needed refinement, and Turing worked obsessively, often going days with minimal sleep, to improve its design. More bombies were built, each one faster and more reliable than the last. By late 1941, Bletchley Park had multiple bombs running around the clock, processing intercepted German messages, and then they started breaking through. First sporadically, then more regularly, Bletchley Park began reading German military communications in near real time. The intelligence they produced was given the code name Ultra, and it was treated with extraordinary secrecy. Only a handful of top military commanders even knew it existed. Churchill himself read the decrypted messages every morning. The impact was staggering. In the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boats had been devastating Allied shipping, Ultra intelligence allowed the Royal Navy to reroute convoys away from submarine wolf packs. Ships that would have been sunk made it safely to port. Supplies that would have been lost sustained Britain through its darkest hours. Military historians estimate that breaking Enigma shortened the Battle of the Atlantic by years. In North Africa, British commanders knew German General Rommel's plans before his own officers did. They could see his supply lines, his troop strengths, his intended movements. What looked like brilliant British tactical decisions were often simply the result of reading the enemy's mail. When the Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, Ultra-intelligence confirmed that Hitler had fallen for the deception plan, believing the real invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. German reinforcements were held back at the wrong location, giving the Allies precious time to establish their beachhead. But Turing's contribution went beyond just the bomb. In 1942, the Germans introduced a more complex version of Enigma for their most secret communications. It used 4 rotors instead of 3, exponentially increasing the possible combinations. The British called this system Shark, and for nearly a year, it was unbreakable. U-boat sinkings skyrocketed. Churchill was desperate. Turing threw himself at the problem with characteristic intensity. He developed new mathematical techniques, new ways of exploiting German operational errors. Finally, in December 1942, Bletchley Park broke Shark. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic turned once again. Ships started getting through. Britain could breathe. Throughout all this, Turing remained an enigma himself. While his colleagues knew he was brilliant, few understood the full scope of his contributions. He didn't seek recognition or glory. He was motivated purely by the intellectual challenge and by the knowledge that lives depended on his work. Every message decoded potentially saved lives. Every day that the code remained unbroken cost lives. There's a famous story from Bletchley Park that captures Turing's character. The codebreakers had decrypted a message revealing that the Germans were planning to bomb Coventry, a major industrial city in central England. The intelligence was solid, specific, and terrifying. But there was a dilemma. If the British evacuated Coventry or put up unusual air defenses, the Germans might realize their codes had been broken. They might change their encryption systems, and Bletchley Park would be back to square one. The decision went to the highest levels of government. In the end, Coventry was not evacuated. The bombing went ahead. Over 500 people died, and much of the medieval city center was destroyed. This was the terrible calculus of Ultra. The intelligence had to be used carefully, sparingly, in ways that wouldn't reveal its existence. Sometimes that meant allowing attacks to happen, letting people die, to protect the larger secret. Turing and his colleagues lived with this burden every day. They knew that their work was saving lives on a massive scale, but they also knew that maintaining secrecy sometimes required terrible sacrifices. By the estimates of military historians, breaking Enigma shortened World War II in Europe by at least 2 years, possibly more. 2 years fewer of concentration camps operating. 2 years fewer of cities being bombed. 2 years fewer of battles being fought. General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, later said that Ultra had been decisive to Allied victory. Some historians believe that without Bletchley Park's success, the Allies might not have won at all, or the war might have dragged on so long that the outcome would have been fundamentally different. Alan Turing had, quite literally, changed the course of history. At age 32, he had made contributions to the war effort that rivaled those of any general or admiral. He had saved hundreds of thousands of lives, perhaps millions. But there was a problem. Because of the extreme secrecy surrounding Bletchley Park, Turing's work had to remain classified. The world couldn't know what he had done. Even after the war ended in 1945, the British government maintained absolute silence about Enigma and Ultra. The Americans had to be told, as allies, but the general public, the British people, even most members of Parliament knew nothing. So when the war ended and Turing returned to civilian life, he was just another demobilized government worker. No medals, no public recognition, no acknowledgement of his extraordinary service. the Enigma machines were destroyed or hidden away. The bombs were dismantled. The thousands of people who had worked at Bletchley Park were made to sign the Official Secrets Act, forbidden from ever speaking about what they had done there. For decades, they couldn't even tell their families. Turing didn't seem to mind the lack of recognition. He had never sought fame. What he wanted was to continue his research, to push the boundaries of what was possible with computing machines. The war had given him ideas, big ideas, about the future of technology. During his time at Bletchley Park, he had seen how machines could be programmed to perform complex logical operations. Now he wanted to explore how far this could go. Could machines think? Could they learn? Could they be truly intelligent? In 1945, Turing was invited to join the National Physical Laboratory in London, where he designed one of the first stored program computers, a machine he called the Automatic Computing Engine, or ACE. His design was years ahead of its time, incorporating ideas about computer architecture that are still fundamental today. But funding was limited, progress was slow, and Turing grew frustrated with bureaucratic obstacles. In 1948, he moved to the University of Manchester, where he worked on the Manchester Mark I, one of the earliest true computers. Here, Turing was in his element, surrounded by engineers and mathematicians who shared his vision. He wrote programs, developed algorithms, and pushed the machine to its limits. He began publishing papers on artificial intelligence, asking questions that seemed like science fiction. Can machines think? How would we know if they could? In 1950, he published a landmark paper titled Computing Machinery and Intelligence, in which he proposed what became known as the Turing test, a method for determining whether a machine could exhibit intelligent behavior indistinguishable from a human. He was, quite simply, decades ahead of his time. The concepts he was exploring, machine learning, artificial intelligence, neural networks, wouldn't become mainstream in computer science for another 50 years. But Turing saw the potential immediately. He envisioned a future where machines could play chess, translate languages, even compose music. His colleagues thought some of his ideas were far-fetched, but Turing was undeterred. He had learned during the war that seemingly impossible problems could be solved with the right combination of logic, persistence, and creative thinking. But while Turing's mind was soaring into the future, his personal life was heading toward tragedy. Alan Turing was gay, and in 1950s Britain, homosexuality was not just socially unacceptable, it was a criminal offense. The same country that Turing had helped save from Nazi tyranny considered his sexuality a crime, punishable by imprisonment. For years, Turing had kept his private life discreet. But in January 1952, his home was burgled. When police investigated, details of Turing's relationship with a young man emerged. In the course of the investigation, both Turing and his partner admitted to a sexual relationship. Turing was arrested and charged with gross indecency, the same charge that had been used to imprison Oscar Wilde half a century earlier. The trial was brief and humiliating. Turing didn't deny the charges. He saw nothing wrong with his sexuality and refused to show the shame that society expected of him. He was convicted. The judge offered him a choice: prison or probation with mandatory chemical castration. The treatment involved injections of synthetic estrogen intended to reduce libido. Turing chose the treatment, likely because prison would have meant the end of his research. For a year, Turing endured the hormone treatments. The effects were devastating. He developed breasts, suffered mood swings, experienced physical and psychological anguish. The brilliant mind that had saved a nation was being poisoned by that same nation's bigotry and fear. His security clearance was revoked, cutting him off from certain types of research. He was no longer trusted by the government he had served so well. Friends and colleagues watched helplessly as Turing withdrew. He continued his work on computers and mathematics, still producing innovative ideas, but the joy seemed to have drained from him. He traveled to Norway and Greece, countries where attitudes toward homosexuality were somewhat more relaxed, perhaps seeking some measure of freedom and acceptance. On June 7, 1954, Alan Turing was found dead in his home. He was 41 years old. Next to his bed was a half-eaten apple laced with cyanide. The coroner ruled it suicide, though his mother always maintained it could have been an accident. Turing was known to be careless with chemicals in his home experiments. We'll never know for certain, but the most likely explanation is that Turing, worn down by persecution, humiliation, and the chemical assault on his body, chose to end his life. The obituaries were brief and superficial. They noted that he was a mathematician and that he had done some government work during the war, but nothing more specific. The true extent of his contributions remained classified. The public had no idea that one of the greatest heroes of World War II had just died in obscurity and disgrace. For decades, that's how it remained. Bletchley Park fell into disrepair, nearly demolished in the 1990s before preservation efforts saved it. The people who had worked there grew old, still bound by their oaths of secrecy. It wasn't until the 1970s that the British government began to declassify information about Ultra and Enigma, and even then, details emerged slowly, reluctantly. As the truth gradually came out, historians began to reassess World War II and the factors that led to Allied victory. Suddenly, Bletchley Park was recognized as one of the most important sites of the war. And at the center of Bletchley Park's success was Alan Turing. The awkward, brilliant mathematician who had died in disgrace was posthumously recognized as one of the greatest figures of the 20th century. In 2009, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a public apology on behalf of the government for the appalling treatment of Turing. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon. In 2017, the Alan Turing Law pardoned all British men who had been convicted under historical laws against homosexuality. Statues and memorials have been erected. The highest award in computer science is named the Turing Award, essentially the Nobel Prize of Computing. But perhaps the most fitting tribute is that Turing's ideas have become reality. Every computer, every smartphone, every artificial intelligence system operating in the world today is built on foundations that Turing helped establish. The Turing test remains a benchmark for AI research. His theoretical work on computation is taught in every computer science program in the world. The digital revolution that has transformed human civilization traces directly back to concepts Turing developed. Modern cryptography, the systems that protect your online banking, your private messages, your medical records, all of it evolved from the code-breaking work done at Bletchley Park. The computers that run our power grids, our hospitals, our transportation systems, they're all descendants of machines Turing envisioned. In a very real sense, we live in the world that Alan Turing imagined. And yet, for all his genius, for all his contributions, Turing's story is also a cautionary tale. It reminds us that brilliance and heroism don't protect anyone from prejudice and injustice. It reminds us that societies can be profoundly ungrateful, persecuting the very people who saved them. It reminds us that secrecy, even when necessary, can have terrible human costs. Think about the bitter irony. Turing helped defeat a regime that persecuted people for who they were, that sought to create a society where only certain types of people were considered acceptable. And then he was persecuted by his own government for exactly the same reason, for being someone who didn't fit into narrow definitions of acceptability. The Nazis used pseudoscience to justify their hatred. The British government used pseudoscience, the idea that homosexuality was a disease that could be cured, to justify Turing's treatment. The greatest codebreaker in history couldn't crack the code of social acceptance. The man who saw through Enigma's complexity couldn't navigate the irrational prejudices of his own society. He could break the unbreakable, but he couldn't break free from being who he was, nor should he have had to. Today, when we use the internet, when we ask Siri a question, when we marvel at what computers can do, we're experiencing the fulfillment of Alan Turing's vision. Every time an AI defeats a human at chess or Go, every time machine learning makes a medical diagnosis, every time natural language processing translates text, we're seeing Turing's ideas come to life. He asked, "Can machines think?" and spent his life trying to answer that question. We're still working on that answer, but we're working with tools and concepts he gave us. But we should also remember the cost. Remember that genius is found in all kinds of people, not just those who fit comfortable stereotypes. Remember that societies that persecute people for who they are don't just inflict suffering, they waste human potential. How many more breakthroughs might Turing have made if he had lived? What problems might he have solved? What technologies might he have invented? We'll never know, because he was driven to his death at age 41. In the end, Alan Turing's story is about secrets, codes, and hidden truths. He spent his career breaking codes, revealing secrets, finding truth hidden beneath layers of encryption. But the greatest secret was his own story, locked away by government classification and social stigma. It took decades for that code to be broken, for his story to be decrypted and shared with the world. He cracked Hitler's code and saved millions of lives. His own country responded by destroying him. It's one of history's greatest injustices and one of its most important lessons. We honor Alan Turing now, not just for what he achieved, but for what he represents. The triumph of intellect, the tragedy of intolerance, and the reminder that the true measure of a society is how it treats its most brilliant and most vulnerable members. Alan Turing was both.